So I've been asked to give you my insights into the topic of concussion. And I'm actually delighted to have that opportunity. I'm an emergency physician, and I have spent my last 20 years working in the area of traumatic brain injury. And interestingly, in recent years, we've shifted so much of our interest in research from what we would call severe injury into the realm of concussion. And we've titled this The Fog of Concussion because if I tell you concussion, I think most of you automatically think, oh, I know what a concussion is. And if you think you know what a concussion is, then you know more than I know, because I'm still not sure really what a concussion is all about. But I'm going to try and share with you some of my thoughts. Now, those of you who are New Yorkers probably know that starting July 1st, New York joined 37 other states in enacting a concussion for student-athlete law. And so in New York, along with 37 other states, a young athlete who sustains a concussion is taken out of play and can't return to play until they see a doctor. And so the obvious question is, well, what is this concussion that they have to have sustained that's taking them out of play? And I think the next question that you're going to logically ask is, what is the doctor going to do to determine that that young athlete can go back into play? And that's an interesting question, and it brings us to the definition process of defining what a concussion is and why all the hype. Because I'll tell you, if you Google concussion, just in the last week, there are hundreds of articles. There are hundreds of articles every week being written on concussion, and there's a lot of talk. There's not a lot of substance to some of the talk. We are on the verge of understanding how the brain works when it's injured, and I think in the next couple years, in the next months, in the next years, we're going to have much greater insight. And so I put up 3 cases that have been high publicity, lots of attention. I want to begin by saying I'm not here to sensationalize concussion at all. In fact, the good news is the majority of patients who hit their head make just a fine recovery. But there are a number of things that happen that's helpful for us to understand. The first case is Zachary Lystet, and Zachary was a 13-year-old middle school football player. He gets hit while he's playing football, falls to the ground, grabs his head, is a bit dazed, and he's taken out of play. This is in 2005, I believe. Taken out of play, he sits for 3 plays, and then he's allowed to go back in and play. The game continues, and in a tackle, in a fumble, Zachary goes down, and he doesn't get back up. And in fact, he doesn't get up for months and months and months. He has a massive hemorrhage. It's complicated exactly what happened to Zachary, but I think we could all agree that if he hadn't been allowed to go back into the game, this tragedy wouldn't have happened. And so this led to the first state law for concussion in young athletes, and that was in Washington State, appropriately named after Zachary. So we'll put that on the side. Remember, these are dramatic cases. Thank God most of the time when a concussion takes place, the outcomes are good. We have Ricky Elder. He's in the Army. He's deployed in the Middle East. He sustained several concussive events from blasts. In his blogs, he writes about how mentally disturbed he is after these blasts. His depression gets worse when he returns to stateside. Perhaps you've read that Zachary ended up killing his superior and then committing suicide. And what this case brings forward is, does concussion lead to behavioral changes? Can concussion lead to depression? And why is there an increased report of suicide in the military? And our military is very interested and concerned about this for obvious reasons. And of course, the last really high-profile case is Ralph Wenzel, NFL player, 66 to 73. He, at a very early age of 55, gets very progressive dementia. And Ralph and his wife, Profetto, Eleonora Profetto, were very instrumental in testifying on Capitol Hill about the risk of repeat concussion causing early dementia. And so these cases are bringing up a lot of why the concern for concussion, why we want to identify it, why we'd like to do something, and of course, can we prevent some of the sequelae from concussion? So it's hot, hot, hot as a topic, and so I'll back up just one step and remind you that we talk about brain injury in terms of severe, moderate, and mild. Patients who have severe injury are in coma. Patients who have moderate injury are lethargic. Patients who have a mild injury are usually alert. Patients with a severe injury usually have an abnormal CAT scan. Patients who have a mild injury, for the vast majority of cases, have a normal CAT scan. So the CAT scan and alertness really aren't helping us determine which of those patients who had a mild injury, and we call a concussion a mild injury, which of those patients are at risk of having some sort of sequelae. Those of you who are parents clearly want to know this because you want to know what's happened to my child, can they go back to play? But remember, when we talk about concussion, it's not just in sports. We hit our head as adults all the time, and we want to ask always, of course, what needs to be done and what are the risks and what's going to happen if I've hit my head. So listen, now that we have made concussion a large concern, I think we've identified it as a major public health issue, not just in the States, but worldwide. We're identifying more cases of concussion. So you'll read reports all the time that more people are getting concussed. Probably not the case. What's happening is we're recognizing concussion more. We're looking for it. And in fact, who knows the real numbers because most people don't seek care, but up to 12 billion Americans have a concussion a year. And we estimate, who knows, but maybe up to 4 million sports-related concussions. 2 million emergency department visits a year for concussion. And up to 300,000 of our soldiers have sustained an injury that would be termed concussion, and up to 30% of them are reporting long-term sequelae. As citizens, and from a public health point of view, you have to appreciate the huge burden this is placing on our VA systems. This is a large number of young people who are at risk for long-term sequelae, i.e. disability. And the question is, yes or no, and how do we define what that disability is? It's really a challenge that's facing us. And so I have to tell you, from my point of view, I have a big interest in this professionally, but before I became a physician, I was a medical student. When I'm a medical student, I'm walking across the street with my wife. This was 32 years ago. And out of nowhere, a motorcycle comes, clips my wife. She flips into the air, hits her head, and is unconscious. And I can remember being absolutely paralyzed and not knowing what to do. And it was at that moment that I said, I want to be an emergency physician so I know what to do when this happens. That's part of my background of getting interested in this. My wife gets admitted to the hospital. She gets better. She gets discharged. And they tell her, you're fine. And she goes home. But she's not fine. In fact, she's experiencing all kinds of things. And 32 years ago, no one was talking about all those things. She couldn't focus. She had no attention. She couldn't sleep. She lost her balance. She had the key things that help us define if someone had a concussion: loss of attention, loss of balance. And she had the other things that are non-specific, like headaches and a feeling of unwellness. And yeah, she wasn't always happy because she was so frustrated. So was it the hit to the head that made her feel depressed? Or was some sort of biologic process taking place as a result of a concussion? And I can't answer that for you today. It's an area of a lot of research. And so my wife then finishes medical school. She goes and becomes a neurologist and then a psychiatrist. And what happened over time is I'm at the beginning of care of a brain-injured patient, and my wife's at the other end of care in patients who have head injury. And we've experienced this whole continuum of care in trying to improve the quality of life for people who injure their head. This continuum of care ends up being one of those key words now in medicine. It's no longer the individual practitioner, because the one thing we've realized is that everything we do is dependent on everything else. And what's emerged in head injury is it doesn't begin with the physician. It really begins with the athletic trainer on the field. So again, we need to make sure our athletic trainers and our coaches are familiar with what a head injury is and what to do. And it begins with our EMTs and our paramedics. And they're the ones who are making decisions related to access to care and resource utilization. And this is fascinating. So if we look at the tragic case of Natasha Richardson, she falls. She obviously hit her head quite hard, or they wouldn't have activated the EMS system. EMS comes, they're dismissed. This is what challenges me every day. This is the nightmare case. The patient who hits their head, looks great, says I'm fine, and 7 hours later are in coma. And the picture on the end is a epidural hematoma, or a bleed in the brain. Fortunately, in concussion, fortunately in those patients who come into the emergency department alert, they stay alert, and fortunately the vast majority of time their CTs are normal. A normal CAT scan, though, doesn't mean there wasn't an injury. And so what we need to do, and I keep coming back to this, is we need a good working definition of concussion so that we're all speaking the same language. If we don't have the same definition, it's very hard for us to communicate. And I'm in the middle right now of a process with the Department of Defense and the Center for Disease Control, actually looking at all the literature on brain injury and trying to distill out of the numerous articles. In fact, there's over 4,500 research papers on concussion, trying to come up with a common definition that defines the parameters. And I can tell you, out of 4,500 scientific papers, there's only 15 that we've deemed to be of good quality. How about that? So there's a lot of research out there that's provocative and stimulating and important to do, but flawed in its design. And I love this article from the New York Times. This was March 19th, 2012. And of course, for those of you who live in New York and maybe have an attitude about New Jersey, to see an article that says New Jersey least corrupt, found as the least corrupt state by the Center for Public Integrity. And the interesting thing about the paper, and they're right on, is sure, they might have been found least corrupt, but they never defined what corruption is. So made it a bit of a circuitous problem. So we have our state legislations for concussion in sports. And I have to tell you, historically, what happened is this. You hit your head, you had loss of consciousness or amnesia, maybe a headache, you were told you had a concussion. End of story. You were told you're okay, and you could go home and you'll be fine. What we didn't have historically is an objective measure that a concussion took place. And that's our search. And I'll give you an example. So if you have, 100 years ago, crushing chest pain, diaphoretic, looking bad, holding your chest, you were diagnosed as having a heart attack. Not everybody with crushing chest pain had a heart attack. So EKGs were developed. You do an EKG, 75 years ago, we start doing EKGs on all chest pain. If you had an abnormal EKG, crushing chest pain, you had a heart attack. The problem is we found out that 50% of people who are having a heart attack have a normal EKG. So EKG is not going to help you diagnose a heart attack. Enter, about 20 years ago, proteins in the blood, troponins, a biomarker, and now in order to be diagnosed with a heart attack, you need the objective test. We are in search of an objective test for concussion. When you have a concussion, historically, you would have loss of consciousness, amnesia, and then there's 4 domains where your mind loses its proper function. People who hit their head will get headaches, fatigue, nausea, These were all the symptoms my wife had. Nobody told her that she had experienced these. You can get behavioral changes. You can feel depressed or anxious and maybe suicidal. Is that part of the concussion? We don't know. You can have neurologic abnormalities. And those neurologic ones are usually a loss of balance. And you can have cognitive problems, meaning loss of attention and loss to process memory. Of this list, the question comes up, what's specific for concussion that we can use for the definition? But I'll tell you something interesting, and I love this because it really makes me think. If I lose balance when I hit my head, and if I lose some of my processing speed, my attention's off, what happens to performance? Why is it that some kids and adults who have one concussion immediately have another concussion? Because attention's off and balance is off. And so one of the reasons we want to get our kids off the playing field, one of the reasons I want to tell the previous speaker on Wall Street, don't trade stocks after you hit your head, is because these things happen. And until they return to normal, you maybe shouldn't be doing full activity. The last thing I want is a soldier who's had a concussion, who's lost some processing speed, to be firing a weapon. And the last thing I want is my quarterback, who depends on split-second thinking, to be out there making decisions for win or lose the game. So now you're kind of understanding why we want to get the kids off the field. Now you're understanding why it's okay not to go back to work for a day or two after you hit your head, or at least not to expect full performance. And for those of us who employ people, maybe it's all right to say, you need a day or two off because I'm going to have more problems if you come back than if you don't. And so what's happened as we've been going through the evidence and trying to come up with our definition, I'll tell you this, loss of consciousness and amnesia, which were the hallmarks of concussion when you read the books, aren't predicted. And less than 30% of people who sustain a concussion, which I haven't defined yet, don't have loss of consciousness or amnesia. Symptoms, they're not specific. So I can tell you this, if you break your leg, you're going to have headaches, you're going to feel foggy, you're going to feel unwell, you'll probably feel nauseated. And these were always the symptoms we thought were so characteristic of concussion. Not to say when you hit your head you don't have symptoms, but they're not specific. CAT scan doesn't help us with concussion. We need an objective measure, and I need that measure to help me say when it's okay to go back to play. That's what we're looking for. And our objective measures are these, and this is what you'll be following. So if you have a child, if they have a concussion, taking out of play, the things that you're really asking from the physician who's caring for them, because listen to this, 38 states have return to play laws. Nobody defines what that doctor's note, what that doctor is supposed to be assessing, though we're getting better at distributing this information. We want to assess attention, and there's various instruments being developed for that. We want to assess the ability to take new information and retain it, and we want to assess balance. And so what I've just told you is the core evaluation of somebody who has a concussion now, and the core part of the evaluation when they get followed up. The exciting areas that are on the horizon that we're all going to be watching very carefully are biomarkers for acute injury. And what that means is when the brain is injured, it will release proteins in the blood. What if I could pick those proteins up, and that's going to be my marker of injury, just like with a heart attack? And we've made a lot of progress in recent years. The FDA hasn't approved a test here in the States, but in Europe, it's commonly used where they'll check a biomarker. We don't know how good these biomarkers are for long-term prognosis, but we know the biomarkers are good for determining whether there's going to be an abnormality on a CAT scan. We're at the infancy of understanding the power of biomarkers. And there's one last area that's so hot now You know, everyone talks about personalized medicine. Part of personalized medicine is looking at your genetic makeup and tailoring your care based on your genetic makeup. And we know that there is a allele, a gene, that predicts recovery and development of dementia. And we know that those people with the gene who have repeat concussion have a much higher incidence of dementia. And so in the age of personalized medicine, perhaps an important screen that will be used in sports or other potentially high impact occupations will be looking at the genetic outcome. So if we take a look at a cartoon that's too busy for anyone really to focus on, I want to make this point. What's happening is this. Concussion is an acceleration, deacceleration injury, often with a rotational component, and in the process, nerves in the brain are stretched. And in that stretch, they're injured, and either they're injured with an immediate biochemical change or with a structural change or both. We think that most of it is biochemical, but those who have structural change, in theory, could develop a scar, and that scar is going to impact long-term function. And we're only in our infancy of understanding this process. And I can tell you our modified or our new definition of concussion, it's not a bruise to the brain. It's not one area of the brain that just gets bruised. What our current thinking of a concussion is, it's a dysfunction of the brain that results from this acceleration, deacceleration, or rotation, and it makes the brain lose some of its connectivity, the connections between different parts of the brain. What we don't know is, why do some people not get better? And why do some people get better and then later in life develop things like depression or dementia? And so I think we have a lot to discover. In the meantime, I think our focus needs to be where it should always be in public health, which is prevention. So the use of helmets and the use of seat belts and the use of proper risk assessment for our children and our family and our colleagues is really fundamental to decreasing the incidence of concussion. And I'll tell you, and I'll leave you at this, when a concussion does occur, what we should be doing is, of course, getting out of play, getting out of work, giving the brain a chance to heal, and then following up with somebody who understands concussion to determine when your brain has made a proper recovery. Thank you.